experience with computers and programming. I believe it started back in rural Maryland. How did you first discover a love for computers and programming?
Well, my brother, who is about 16 years older than me, left and flew off to California to take a job when I was about 10. And then I had the opportunity to go and visit him. He had a job in computers. He had a room full of computers at home, and then worked with massive computers at work. And so I got my first hands-on experience touching a computer, learning to program in BASIC out there just over the course of a few days, and it was astonishingly cool experience. And so I begged and pleaded to get a computer at home, and when I was 11, I got an Apple II computer and learned to program on that. From that point on, I've spent the majority of my waking hours with computers.
Okay. So it was very immediately something you were captivated and fascinated by?
Yeah, absolutely. Since I was really young, I've always been trying to build things. Go-karts, forts, anything I could nail together. The problem with mechanical things was they never quite worked. But a wheel would come loose and fall off, and your go-kart would break. There was always something going wrong. But with computers, I had the realization that a computer could do absolutely anything as long as you could figure out how to issue the right commands to get it to do that.
Right, okay. And how quickly did you find yourself kind of au fait with working with computers? Was it something that came to you naturally, if such a thing is possible?
It was a very slow learning process. I had a manual in BASIC, but being 11 years old, I was missing a lot of the concepts that were key to computer science. I remember, for the first 6 months or so, I was writing this adventure game where you go around from one room to another. And every time I created a new room, I had to reprogram the entire game's logic for accepting input and moving the character around, because I didn't have this idea of subroutines.
Right, okay. But there must be advantages to that kind of freedom from knowing the conventions?
Yeah, well, all along, I've always figured things out on my own, and then afterwards I'll look through the literature and see if there are some references that systematize it more thoroughly. Once I discovered subroutines, then I went back to all of the old programs I'd written, and I restructured them and found that they were 10 or 20 times shorter, just because, well, that's a pretty key component to computing. And it's been like that ever since. Graphics, algorithms, everything else. I'd always figure it out on my own and then read about it.
Okay. And were you just making games at this point, or were you just fascinated by coding and programming in general?
Well, I was really fascinated by two separate types of things. One was developing games, just because the idea that you have this player who's moving around in a game environment in real time and interacting with virtual objects, that was just really fascinating. The other thing that really was interesting from the very beginning was communication. Back before the internet was available to the public, we had bulletin boards. You'd have a modem, you'd call up on your phone, and you'd be communicating with other people using these programs that stored messages like a modern message board. I spent a lot of time writing communication programs, just because that was another fascinating thing. If you could reach out with your modem, you can connect and potentially share data with anybody on the earth.
Okay. And I believe at this time your academic endeavours, your studies took you to engineering. When was the point you realised that you wanted to commit your life to programming?
Well, I didn't realise early on that I could actually make a living with computers. It was something I just treated as a labour of love rather than a potential career. And by the time I was, 18 and entered University of Maryland, I knew so much about computers, I found computer science uninteresting, and I studied mechanical engineering. And that was really useful, because in mechanical engineering, we were forced to learn all of the math about how objects collide, interact, break. Basically, everything you learn there is essential to creating a computer simulation of a 3D environment of some sort. I didn't realize it at the time, so it was kind of like the Karate Kid, I learned all of these skills in the university. I was like, what the hell am I supposed to do with these matrices and eigenvalues? As I learned all of these techniques, it was just a little bit bizarre. But then a few years later, around 1995, I was programming the first Unreal Engine, and I realized that those were exactly the components I needed to put together a 3D engine.
And did you complete your studies with engineering, or did you break away and go down the coding route before then?
No, I was in the university for 4 years. I ended up being 2 credits short of graduating,
Right.
and I just didn't want to continue at school. At that point in time, I employed 4 people in my parents' basement.
Right.
I'd make games by night, and then they'd sell the discs and ship them off to customers by day. So I just decided to jump into that full time.
So at that point, you were starting to, I presume the first games you were making, you said earlier, a labour of love. When did the point come when you had an audience for your games and you were releasing them to people?
Gosh, from the time I was 11 to about 21, I probably wrote several hundred games, starting with really small, trivial ones, but getting larger and larger over time. I just never realized, I never thought that they were very good. I was looking at high-end commercial games at the time, like Ultima and so on, and they were just so much better than anything I'd created that I didn't think I was worthy. But there was a point when I'd created this really fun little text-based action game. You'd move around the screen and you'd fight these Greek characters that were attacking you in real time. It was a really fun game, and I started inviting neighbor kids over of all ages. Everyone from like 4 to 30 would come by my house and play the game, and as they'd play it, I'd take notes on what they enjoyed and where they got stuck. And after I'd done a lot of that and tuned the game, I realized, this actually had some potential. So I released that as shareware, and from the very beginning, it was making about $100 a day, and it's like, wow, I'm rich.
And do you still have those original games tucked away, saved anywhere?
Oh, yeah. We have all of Epic's games going back to 1991 along a big wall in Epic, going from ZZT up to Unreal.
And what about your personal titles from before then? Are they still lurking somewhere on discs?
Oh, yeah. I have a bunch of Apple II discs full of old games. Nothing impressive, but...
And so, before we move on to kind of Epic becoming Epic, something I read was that early on, to fund your purchasing of computer equipment, you were mowing lawns for money.
Right.
In the video at the awards last night, Mark mentioned when he first met you, he was impressed that the business magazines you were reading and so on. How early did the association between business and games, how early in your experience with games was that present, and when did you realise that was important?
I felt that commercial game development was out of reach until I saw shareware games come along. And one company, Apogee Software, who created a lot of the early 3D games, early 2D games, like the original Duke Nukem, not the 3D game, but the 2D game, and others. When I saw that, I came to the realization that you didn't have to have a massive company with manufacturing capability and worldwide distribution to retail stores to succeed. All you needed was a great game and a mailing address and the ability to copy discs and take orders. And so at that point, I saw the potential viability of starting a game company, and really started to look into how to do that successfully and systemically. So I started reading about business and accounting and all of the other prerequisites you'd need to actually run a company successfully. And that's always been a fascinating part of Epic's effort, is we try to integrate great game design, great artwork, great technology, and prudent business dealing, because it's a really hard industry economically. It goes through lots of ups and downs, and you're constantly fighting for survival.
So it sounds like that prudent business dealings were something. There's almost a cliche. Artists, coders, they're not businessmen. They're kind of interested in their own endeavour. But it seems for you, you were excited by both the business and the coding from an early stage.
Yeah, exactly. I was excited about the business aspect of it too. I wasn't particularly good at it, but I recognized the importance. And that's a really key thing in starting a company. It's to recognize your strengths and weaknesses and find people who are better than you at everything that's not your strength. And that's kind of the history of Epic. Bringing on Mark Rain early on to negotiate business deals. He is an awesomely talented negotiator, which was a great compliment to my programming.
Fantastic. So, just to confirm, just to take a few steps back, you were starting to sell your games and you were making $100 a day. When was the point that Epic started to exist as a company?
Well, I would say from that very moment of the games being released, I really made a point of trying to build a business out of it rather than just releasing a game and seeing what happened. Releasing these games, it wasn't, send a check to Tim Sweeney. From the very beginning, it was Epic Mega Games. The idea was, we wanted to make it look like this was a real company and not just some kid in a basement. from the very beginning, I put out a call to other potential or aspiring game developers to submit their games to Epic so that we could publish them. I saw that Apogee Software was doing that with their shareware games, and it looked like a really interesting way to build and expand a business. Potentially I could make $100 a day from more than one game and be really rich.
And I think, am I right, some of those aspiring game developers that responded to your request became core, important members of the Epic team?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a really amazing time because the game industry had existed for 6 or 7 years then. Everybody knew retail games, but there was kind of the second generation of game developers who were really young, getting started, who'd developed really great skills but didn't have the outlet for their work. And so a lot of the really talented guys in the industry who saw Epic Mega Games' call for authors started submitting their stuff, and I was just astonished at the breadth of talent that we were able to reach that way.
And how did you come about having Mark join the team?
Well, so in 1992, after I'd put out my second game, Joel of the Jungle, Mark was president of id Software. Because prior to joining Epic, he talked his way into that company too. Of course, the id guys at that point in time had created Commander Keen, a really awesome side-scrolling game, but hadn't had their major success with 3D games yet. And so Mark had joined them to negotiate business deals while they built games. And I was in touch with him somehow. He was active, I think, on an early bulletin board with CompuServe. I told him about my game and asked for some advice, and he asked me to send a copy. So I mailed him a copy of my disc, and he called me back and was gushing about how amazing Joel of the Jungle was and how we should try to figure out some way for id to publish it. id decided not to go that route with their business, but just continually developing games, and so that didn't come to fruition. But at some point id went through a complicated business negotiation with a publisher and turned into an us versus them situation. So id Software fired Mark Rain, which was an awesome boon for Epic because the moment that happened, we got in touch again, and we saw the great opportunity of working together. And that happened, I think, late 1992.
And I guess then eventually the model moved from shareware in the build-up to assembling the team that would make the first Unreal. What were the kind of major changes the company went through in that period?
Well, after I'd created the company's first 2 games, just mostly by myself, the big effort was to recruit other developers to join Epic and produce games. And a lot of really amazing people showed up that way. Cliff Bleszinski, who later was the designer of Jazz Jackrabbit, and co-designer of Unreal and designer of Gears of War. He'd written a little graphical adventure game in Visual Basic, like a Sierra-style game.
Right.
He submitted that to Epic, and we published it. That was how we hooked up with him. Another really talented developer was James Schmaltz, who went on to found Digital Extremes.
Right.
He built a little space adventure game, and then went on to create Epic Pinball.
Okay.
And so we had this really nice and growing stable of developers building shareware games with small teams. Like a team would be 1 or 2 or 3 people working for 6 or so months to create a game. But after Wolfenstein 3D came out, that really changed the game industry. We realized that, okay, these small 2D games aren't exciting anymore. Everybody's going to want to play these big 3D games. They require new development expertise, and they require much larger teams. We're looking at id Software being about 10 people at that time, which was massive. And so we decided at that point that we needed to get into that. We had to figure out 3D development, and we had to put all of our best people together to form a team to make 3D games. We went through several stages of figuring out who would do what, but we largely settled on me building the 3D engine for the game and the editing tools. And James Schmaltz, author of Epic Pinball, would take on the artwork and modeling and be a co-designer alongside Cliff Bleszinski, who would help design the game and also do level design, which was funny because absolutely none of us had any of the skills necessary to do that. But we went through a learning process. We started in 1995 and shipped 3.5 years later. And during that 3.5 years, we never thought we were more than 6 months away from shipping the game. So it was a crazy learning experience, but we actually figured out all of the major aspects of 3D development and released the game successfully in 1998.
But I guess that was continuing, that learning experience was continuing when what you were doing when you were a kid learning with an Apple II, right? It was exactly the same approach.
Oh yeah, exactly. And it was a neat point then. I'd learned all of the basics of programming, but didn't know 3D, yet I'd learned all of the skills in engineering. And so as I went through the tasks of building like a 3D renderer, the editing tools, math necessary for the constructive solid geometry approach which we used for building levels, it was just a step after step of implementing engineering knowledge on the computer, which I'd really never done before. And that was a fascinating and incredible time.
And then I guess the next major change for the company became when you started providing middleware and your engine to other studios. How did it come about that you became a middleware provider?
It was really interesting. We began building our game and publicizing it from the very beginning in 1995. Then in 1996, a couple of companies called us up and said they were interested in using our game engine to build their own games. And we were like, oh, I guess we have a game engine. We have this base of code that we've been using to build our game. For the beginning also, we'd thought about building the Unreal Engine for multiple games. We were just thinking we would build more games over time, but we realized right then that there was potentially a market for helping other companies make games with this technology. The two companies were Microprose, who built a Star Trek-based game early on, and Legend Entertainment, who built Wheel of Time, a really impressive role-playing fantasy game. So from the very beginning, from the second year of Unreal development onward, we were dividing our efforts between building our own games and helping partners build their games. And from the very beginning, it was very collaborative, open, and partner type of relationship.
Right.
We just set up this big mailing list because everybody was in a different location. We had this big email list that everybody participated in, and it was just a free-for-all of people asking questions and helping each other and sharing knowledge. And so, all the teams using Unreal kind of became an extension of our own team.
Okay. And we're kind of, getting near to the present day now, but I just wondered, in terms of Epic as it exists today, how much of the company culture, or even the spirit of what Epic is, still exists that was the part of the company from the earliest days? Is that still the same thing?
Yeah, that's the funny thing about a lot of the key guys at Epic. We really haven't changed at all in the 22 years we've been in business. We're still the crazy game developers we've always been. From the beginning, even from my first game, we've aimed not only to create games, but also to create tools and release them to users and then developers, to enable the community to do cool stuff with our technology. And so, we've gone through ups and downs with different products over time, but it's always been a core aspect of our business that we're not just making games to sell them. We're real core participants in this industry and really love to see other people do cool stuff with their tools and share knowledge with other developers.
And Epic certainly, from both the games you've made and the tools, you've kind of, something I heard said on stage yesterday, set the tone, you've been, it's kind of naff to use words like cutting edge, but Epic have been there, both kind of, setting the way things are done. How as a company have you managed to be ahead of the curve in that regard? How is it about flexibility? It's just you guys always seem to be there doing it rather than reacting to it.
Yeah, I think it's the realization from the very beginning that we're going through a business with a business model that's constantly changing. We were only 3 years into our company's history when we realized that building 2D shareware games wasn't going to cut it anymore.
Right.
And so we had to completely reorganize ourselves with all of the existing people to do something completely different, building big 3D games. And so we've been especially wary of upcoming technology and platform changes that are going to change the dynamics of the business. And we've gone through 3 really major changes in business model, from 2D to 3D. And then from the early Unreal days, we were a PC developer building retail games. We recognized in 2006 that the console industry was growing at a much more rapid rate, and the PC gaming industry was declining due to piracy, and because a huge number of low-end PCs had this Intel integrated graphics technology that just wasn't capable of running 3D games. At that point, we decided to switch over, become a console-focused game developer and technology provider. That effort launched us into Gears of War, which was the new era of Epic.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing things change again. As soon as Apple came out with the iPhone 3GS, we saw that here's a phone that was capable of running modern 3D technology. So, we didn't decide we should go write some new technology for it. We took the Unreal Engine and ported it to it, and really set out to show the industry that it was possible to apply AAA, console and PC game development techniques to mobile game development, both with the technology and with the games like Infinity Blade for iPhone. And now we're in the middle of another big business model transition. This time it's going from retail-focused console games to online games operated as a persistent service for any platforms that will support it. It's another big change, but we've always been cognizant that the industry is in constant turmoil and change, and the companies that react to it well are the survivors.
So when was it that you personally noticed that mobile would probably matter to the industry and to Epic?
I have to admit, I really didn't notice it. So Apple would come out with the iPhone. It was a cool phone, but I didn't see the potential for it. I think it was the iPhone 3, Mark Rain was constantly playing games as soon as the App Store came out and saying, Tim, we've got to port the Unreal Engine to this. And I was like, oh, that would never work. It's a slow little cell phone. But a couple of generations of phone later, everybody in the company came to the realization that it was possible. We're a very flexible company. When we see an idea emerge that's potentially going to change the industry, whether it comes from a company founder or any engineer within the whole company, we're willing to jump on it, recognize it, and completely change direction if we think it's appropriate.
And more on the subject of mobile, how do you feel kind of the middleware market and tools and what's possible with tools will evolve on mobile? Where's that going?
Well, it's interesting. For about 25 years, we saw games evolve from the early computer gaming days up to the high-end AAA console era. Every year, budgets would increase significantly, team sizes would increase significantly, and the business kept building up to this bigger and bigger scale of development. And then that was all reinvented with mobile gaming. Once the App Store became a really vibrant marketplace, the whole industry kind of started over from scratch, where you could build a game again with 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 people and be successful without a massive budget or a massive development cycle. So it's been awesome to watch that market evolve up to the point where teams are getting bigger and we're seeing budgets increase, and the market's being separated more and more into winners versus losers. It feels like we're playing the last 25 years of game industry history at a rate of 4 years every year. So we're going through a lot of the interesting challenges that the game industry went through back then. In the very beginning of mobile development, you didn't need an engine because you were just building a small line, 10,000 lines of code. You didn't need it. And then as these small teams came along, they fought to engines that were very simple to learn and had an appropriate feature set for games with smaller teams. The Unity engine has really been thriving in that market. They did a great job of exploiting really satisfying the needs of mobile developers. While we've taken the Unreal Engine and moved it down, by porting the engine to other platforms. With Unreal Engine 3, we really didn't go and address the core usability issues, that somebody would want in building a mobile game. If you're going to build a AAA console game with 100 people, you're okay spending a few months learning the technology, but nowadays a mobile game developer expects to download the thing, learn it, and be building a game in within a day or two. And so that's really the trend that's shaping the mobile game industry right now. And making the transition to Unreal Engine 4, that's been a huge focus of ours, to greatly simplify the usability and learnability of the tools. With the goal of creating one engine that you can use to build anything from the smallest game with a single person all the way up to a multi-100-person AAA console game. That's been a big challenge. It's really exciting to see what everybody else is doing in the mobile space. There's Unity, there are some really excellent 2D game engines empowering different kinds of games out there, and it feels like the early days of the 3D PC gaming industry too. Constant innovation. The days of Quake and Wolfenstein, where every month there was something crazy new coming out that was proving new things possible.
And I'm certainly going to come back to Unreal Engine 4, but we've been talking about mobile. Obviously, consoles still exist. I'm sure you've heard of the fact that the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One are coming. How positive and optimistic do you feel about the next generation of consoles and their impact on the industry?
Well, You know, the industry is widening in terms of games. You're not seeing console gamers give up on console gaming and move to mobile games. What you're seeing is mobile games have come along and greatly broadened the industry's scope. There are now, you know, several billion people playing games who didn't play games previously. I think that you know, just increases the overall size of the entertainment market. There are a certain set of games that you really want to play sitting in front of your television in a very immersive experience. And I think all of these different game markets will exist side by side, and they'll overlap more and more over time. But I would kind of compare the AAA console gaming and mobile gaming to YouTube versus you know full feature movies.
Yeah.
If you want to watch a stupid cat video, you don't go do it on your TV. But if you want to play Call of Duty for 5 hours competitively, you don't do it on your little mobile device.
Yeah, sure. And so we've kind of talked about the diversity of platforms there. How are you seeing kind of cross-platform development evolve, and how is Epic embracing that? Well,
you know, for a long time, the platforms were so far apart in their technical capabilities that it was almost impossible to support anything more than PC and high-end PC and console together. But now the market's really converging on this common feature set. You know, there's PC, there's console, there are mobile platforms, iOS, Android, both smartphones and tablets, and there's also web game development. And they're all converging on this common feature set, you know, marked by C++ programming support, high-end, you know, shader-based graphics programming based on DirectX 9 or 11 capabilities, multi-core CPUs, and high-resolution displays. You know, even now with Unreal Engine 3, we did this experiment working closely with Mozilla. We took Unreal Engine 3's 2 million lines of C++ code, ran it through Apple's Clang compiler to create LLVM assembly language code, and then outputted that to JavaScript code. And so we basically cross-compiled the Unreal Engine code to run in a web browser, just in a standards-based web browser using HTML5 and JavaScript, you know, using WebGL for graphics. And it was a stunning realization that that's at all possible. Now you can take potentially any C++ application and run it on the web. I mean, that means that there's a real genuine convergence between the web, you know, the web's programming capabilities as a platform and other platforms. It means now increasingly we can think about building one game and then shipping it on every platform that's appropriate. And we're now thinking about building all of our games looking first at PC as a platform, and then porting and supporting console platforms in the same game, potentially porting it down to tablets wherever the control scheme is appropriate, and also porting it and running it on the web. So we could potentially reach a much larger audience. This will be increasingly important worldwide. You know, consoles are specific to, you know, the Western markets, North America, Europe. They really don't exist in Korea, China, which represents half of the gaming market. Those are PC online games, but I think we can build one game that appeals to all markets by supporting all the platforms that are popular there.
And so finally, time to talk in a bit more depth about Unreal Engine 4. The first question I wanted to ask is, when will we kind of really see that impact in terms of the games people are playing, whether it be on their mobile or in their living room or in a Korean gaming cafe? And I guess what will that impact be?
Well, really, Unreal Engine 4 is aimed for next-generation game development, scaling from mobile all the way up to high-end AAA. For game developers, the rush is on right now.
Yeah.
There are numerous AAA games and also some smaller projects being built with Unreal Engine 4 right now, everywhere in the world. I think you know, the end of next year is really going to be the sweet spot for gamers seeing the games and their capabilities. There are some really exciting things happening on the console platforms and also in free-to-play game development in Korea. They're really going to change things in some interesting ways. I can't spoil their thunder, but
yeah,
it's all coming up and it's all starting to come together.
And I guess now Unreal Engine 4 is out in the wild, so to speak. I guess that's when there'll start being feedback and the engine will start to evolve. Is that part of the plan?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, with Unreal Engine 4, we're looking at this as the start of a 10-year development project. It's been going on for about 2 years now, and on a large scale. And there's not going to be a point when the engine is done. It's going to constantly evolve and improve over time. And you know, on a lot of these platforms, the hardware will be constantly evolving and improving. And so it's going to be an ongoing effort. But since, there are multiple games in full production now that are doing some really, really neat things.
How nerve-wracking or exciting is it actually being out there after all the work?
It's really cool. This time around, in the engine transition from UE3 to UE4, we've made some really big and dramatic decisions and changes. Unreal Engine 3 development was based on this scripting language called Unreal Script. All gameplay code was written in it. Had some advantages and disadvantages, but with this new generation, we've eliminated all of that. Everything is pure C++ code, which opens up to higher performance programming and solves some other interesting problems. We've also completely reinvented the rendering architecture and reinvented the tools and the user interface around a much greater focus on usability. So I was saying earlier, if you're going to have 400 people spend a few years building a game, it's okay if there's a learning curve. It's like building a skyscraper. You're okay with that. But the casual game developers who are getting into an engine want something that's very, very easy to figure out. That's been a major focus in how we've structured the engine. And to have that alongside all of the functionality for AAA game development, it's a really interesting challenge. You want to have something that's easy to learn, but also very deep with functionality that can be discovered as you're using it over time.
And you mentioned that learning curve again, then what kind of advice would you have for smaller studios? Maybe there's people in the audience whose studio is 6 months, a couple of years, 4 years into their process. What advice would you have in kind of how to approach that learning curve, how to be flexible as a studio?
Well, I would give everybody the same advice that I've applied to Epic's company development over the years, and that is that the industry is constantly changing. And we have to be constantly reinventing ourselves, our game development approach, and our teams in order to succeed. There was a time when there were a small number of mobile games out there in the App Store that were really good, and lots of teams were releasing new games and doing really well from them. Now the stakes are increasing. There's a lot more competition. The App Store is now to the point where if you're in the top 10, you're making hundreds of millions of dollars. If you're in the top 100, you're making a really great living, and if you're not there, then you might not even be making a living. The average App Store app has a revenue of about $50,
Right.
which is terrifying.
Yeah.
To go out and invest in that. We all need to be thinking about how to scale up games to really stand apart given the competition. What that means next year is going to be different than what it was last year.
And something, I mentioned kind of the word indie when I asked you that question. Of course, it's people might forget that Epic is, of course, an indie. You guys are independent. How much does that continue, just, your huge kind of size as a company and your cultural impact on games development? You're still an indie. Is that important to the company?
Yeah, we still have that philosophy throughout everything we do. We're not a huge corporation analyzing which markets we should enter. We're just building games that we love to build and releasing them, hoping that users will love them too. One thing that's really changed with this new generation, though, is last generation, most of the company was focused on building Gears of War 3, a massive project.
Yeah.
Gears of War 1 was a 60-person project at peak. Gears of War 3 was more than 100 people at peak. Now we're building several games at different scales. We're building Fortnite, a PC online game, which is a really fun, cool kind of Minecraft meets Left 4 Dead 2 building game.
Right.
It's a 35-person team. It's not aiming to beat Call of Duty in terms of graphics, and it's more of a Pixar art style. A limited project in scope, just aimed at fun, as opposed to massive breakthroughs in scale.
Yeah.
Building a bigger, more AAA shooter project that hasn't been announced yet, and we'll also have internally started developing a really tiny project with 2 or 3 guys working together as a team for a few months to prove out Unreal Engine 4 for very small scale game development.
Right.
That's really cool. We're testing our engine development at all scales and learning as we go. And it's been amazing watching the Chair Entertainment team, who's part of Epic, who built Infinity Blade. They've scaled up from 12 people at inception up to about 25 people now building mobile games with bigger and better graphics. We're trying to master development at every scale so that we can understand how all of our different customers we'll use the engine. And it's quite different with these different project sizes.
Yeah, it sounds like an exciting time. So yeah, time has run away with me rather. I've suddenly been given the notice that we haven't got long left. So are there any questions out there? Hold on, somebody's got to want to put their, fantastic. So if you could wait for the microphone to get to you. I think it's about the third row, the lady with the blonde hair. Yeah, if you could just briefly say your name and who you are before your question, that'd be great.
Well, I'll ask anyway.
Yeah, shout, just shout.
With the changing landscape on scripting languages and less performant languages coming to the fore, what do you think the future of C and coding to the metal and computer shading and that kind of stuff is?
Still, C++ remains the common language for serious programming. It's a harder language to learn than Java or C#, but we really constantly look at it as the way to write native code that targets all platforms, PC, mobile, and now the web also. It's the common language of computing, and so that's our real focus for code development. We're also, with Unreal Engine 4 especially, really working to empower artists and creative folks with visual scripting languages. Instead of code writing, connecting components together visually as blueprints to define game functionality, game behavior, interaction with the environment. And we found that really fruitful, that a designer can now go out and conceive something, build the art assets for it, and then make it actually work without any programming has been incredibly valuable. And so different companies have looked at this in different ways in the past. We're now looking at game development as C++ for programmers and visual scripting for designers and any other non-programmers. And then there are a small number of domain-specific languages like shading languages for targeting specific hardware. But really, right now, we're only looking at one such language, the compute shader language that's used in DirectX and OpenGL. I don't foresee that increasing. In fact, one of our big initiatives with Unreal Engine 4 has been to eliminate all of the other domain-specific languages from the engine itself. We got rid of Unreal Script. We got rid of the use of C# for much of the Unreal Editor user interface. The problem with having multiple programming languages interacting is, even though each programming language has some special strengths to a certain base of users, interop between programming languages absolutely sucks. You spend a lot of time deciding, should I put this function in C++ or C# or Unreal Script? And if you put it in one place, then it's not generally accessible from other places. Whereas if your entire application and all of its user code is in C++, then any part of the engine or game can communicate with any other part in a very natural way. And we found that that's, that way more than offsets the negatives of C++ being a more complex programming language than the others.
Fantastic. So yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, the lady right next to the microphone.
Just a quick one. I represent the Tiny Itai indie that published a game on the App Store. And my question is, how long do you think it is going to take before Unreal Engine 4 works for mobile?
We have a mobile support up and running right now in Unreal Engine 4 in early stages. We have a few source code licensees who are using it. It will be in really good shape for licensees by the end of the year. In the meantime, we're still building our last Unreal Engine 3 title for mobile platforms using Unreal Engine 3, and that's been a good trade-off so far. With UE4, we see that that's the long-term solution. We think there will be a lot of games shipping next year using UE4 for mobile.
Forgot to mention we used UDK for our little adventure. Okay.
Yeah, well, with Unreal Engine 3, we also created the free Unreal Development Kit that was released to the whole world, which is the way that you could get into the engine without having a special business relationship with Epic. That was a huge boon to UE3. We have some big plans for UE4, but stay tuned.
And I think we're probably almost out of time, but are there any more questions out there? Very close to the microphone again in the chat with the...
Hey Tim, I'm Stuart from Crytek. I was just wondering, what do you actually get to do on a day-to-day basis these days? Are you quite close to the front line of the coding, or do you more of an architecture side of things? And do you get to do these little prototype games anymore?
Oh, yeah, I'm spread a little bit thin right now. The programming team on Unreal Engine 4 banned me from checking in code because I had a habit of checking in code and then going off and being away on business trips for a few weeks at a time. But I'm still doing a lot of research type coding just to explore possibilities. I have some little graphical prototypes exploring different techniques, and also have been prototyping a future programming language that solves some problems related to verifying code correctness at compile time, and also making multi-threading support automatic as opposed to implicit. Those are all little side projects, but most of my time is now spent just overseeing Epic's business and technical direction, which has been a big effort recently. As we've been making this big business transition from the last generation to the new generation. It's required reinventing a lot of our assumptions about how our business works, how we develop games, and what platforms we develop them for.
But you're not having to mow any more lawns to buy hardware equipment?
No, we have plenty of hardware now.
Brilliant. Did you get Mark to do that? And I'll tell you what, God, now the hands are shooting up. We've only got a little bit of time, but as we haven't asked anyone on the left yet, right at the back, there's a guy, standing up. Fantastic.
Hi, thank you very much. How do you prioritize your team's work in terms of working on these massive AAA games like Gears of War 3, at the same time having to do an engine that is going to be used by so many studios? So do you have like different teams, like completely separate, or?
Oh yeah, sure. Epic is organized into several development teams. There's an engine development team, and then there are game development teams. And the boundary between them is quite blurry. A lot of the engine features are developed by game teams, and a lot of the engine team are contributing to features directly necessary to ship an Epic game or licensee games at different times. So there's it's a pretty big team. There are over 100 developers at Epic now.